are listening to Above Paranormal Network. You can learn more by going to aboveparanormal.com. This is Talking to the Dead with Fred. I'm Fred, and I'm a psychic medium. Join us as we explore the paranormal together. This week's episode is all on hauntings of the holidays and, of course, haunted toys. I'm excited to have my friend and colleague Roxy with me. Roxy is an empath and the founder of San Antonio Supernatural Paranormal. Roxy is also a collector of haunted objects, but especially haunted toys. Welcome, Roxy.
Thank you for having me again, Fred.
I'm so happy to have you. I'd love to visit with you, and this is the perfect time to do this episode because, of course, you love to collect haunted toys. You love to collect haunted dolls, and this is Christmas, and Christmas is very much categorized for a lot of people by toys, and a lot of people's early memories of Christmas involves toys. So I think it's really cool that we're here in your dining room, and we're surrounded by this amazing collection of haunted toys. So I'm really, really excited to be here and to be able to, who knows, we maybe even get a little EVP from one of the toys around us.
You never know.
But, toys are often associated with Christmas because of Santa Claus.
Yes, yes.
And so I think it's really cool that we can incorporate the haunted part of the toy world within a Christmas episode. So let's get started. So tell me, I guess, just a little bit about your collection. I'd love to learn more.
I think part of my collection, there are some attachments to some of the pieces I have. Other ones are more oddities that I collect, but definitely dolls and toys and things related to items when we were children have a deep calling to me. They always have.
Sure.
And those have always been my, I guess, favorite things to collect. But if you come here, I've got all kinds of things, and I do apologize for my dog barking in the background.
No problem.
So, but dolls and toys, clowns, those kind of things, I guess, that were important to us as children. As we grow older, they still have a lot of meaning to me. And in particular, those are the ones that I like the best to collect.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I know that you love to collect these things, but, why do you think that you personally are so attracted to these objects that are haunted?
I think as a child, I always just had a gift. And as I got older, I just really was looking for answers to explain the things that had happened to me and the things that I saw. And there was always a fascination for me with the toys, the dolls, the rocking chairs, the carriages, even, model airplanes. And I go to antique stores or estate sales and things like that, and I might see a train set that attracts my attention, or sculptures and dolls from all over the world that I've brought in. And I think a lot of that just has to do with having, as a child, not been able to express myself or,
Sure.
Go into that realm, where now as an adult, I can venture into that world and be Roxy and collect what Roxy wants to collect and have my own little paranormal toy museum, oddity museum kind of going on for myself.
Yeah, and I love that it's all in your dining room, so everybody who comes
all in my
over can see it and experience it for themselves. And I think it's really cool. Hopefully we can post some pictures along with this when we post some of the toys. So
absolutely.
Yeah. So why do you think? Or I guess, what do you think creates, a haunted object? More specifically, a toy. What do you think creates, or helps to create a toy to become haunted?
Well, when we're talking about hauntings, I think there can be different things that we can associate that with. Normally, with my objects, they're usually attachments. So in life, there's usually something that you can think back of, maybe to your first Holly Hobbit doll or your first Cabbage Patch doll or something, or your first train set or something that was
Sure.
important to you as a child.
Yeah.
As we grow older, those childhood memories are still there with us. So I think in passing, sometimes things attach themselves to toys that either remind them of something or that were important to them, kind of staying here in a way because they're not ready to move on. And that's very different than something like a poppet or a voodoo doll.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So, um, puppets, I think kind of that's where we get some of this, like, kind of haunted history starting there. And, people would believe, in Europe and, of course, in Salem, that one could bewitch a puppet or, put in energy or spirit to torment somebody with that. And so, you find some of the victims of the Salem witch trials, they may have had a puppet, which could have just literally been a toy, but they had that puppet in their home. And that's what, ended up killing them in the long run, or, making them hang. And I think that, it's interesting that there is such a dark history with simple things like dolls and puppets, and then you mentioned voodoo and voodoo dolls, and I think a lot of people think, oh, voodoo dolls are so scary, and here they are, and you can kill somebody by utilizing the right aspects of the voodoo doll. But really, I think voodoo often gets this horrible rap within our community because it's associated with evil, and it's really not evil at all. It's not negative. There's no negative presence. It's this belief in one God, and that the Loa have all these attributes of God. And so the real idea of just the voodoo doll, it comes from record keeping. Where voodoo practitioners, especially here in America, especially speaking of New Orleans style voodoo, these people were mostly at that time, they were African Americans, or they were Black people, and they weren't given the opportunity to learn to read or write, and so they used voodoo dolls as a record keeper. So the client came in and they said, oh, I need you to work on my husband's heart. Maybe he's being unfaithful to me. And so they would then put a little needle in the heart area of that voodoo doll. So that way, instead of keeping a note, well, I did this for them, when they come in again, they would bring that in and they would ask, well, how is that infidelity working? Is it okay? Is he, can we remove the pin out of that voodoo doll and concentrate on something else? And maybe he's having trouble with, intimacy. He isn't able to be intimate for whatever, maybe a medical reason. Right. So then you take that needle and you put another needle in that area, the right area. And so it's just an idea of being able to keep track of things and to organize oneself. But, I think that both puppets and voodoo dolls, they get this bad rap. And really they're just, I think that it's just very interesting that we go over that. But I do think there's a lot of fear that people have when they go and they see a voodoo doll, especially if it's in an odd location, or they see like this scary looking puppet. And usually puppets are made out of like natural materials, so they're gonna be a little weird looking, and so I think that it's interesting that we have spent so much time is anywhere in the world, but I think specifically so as Americans, concentrating on the darkness of toys and this understanding. And I do think that there's a lot of people that are fascinated with that.
So would you say that when people talk about vessels, dolls being vessels, how would you explain that to our listeners, what a vessel would actually be with a doll?
Well, I think, when you look at a vessel, that word, I think when I hear it, I think of conjure work, and conjure work is popular in certain belief systems, such as hoodoo, not to be confused with voodoo. But conjure work is also, popular in Santeria and other things where, you call upon a spirit to inhabit something. And this can be both for good or for bad. but the idea is, utilizing, an item such as a toy or a doll to become a vessel in itself for a spirit.
Okay.
Where there is an attachment. So I think you can have a haunting that way. That's not a problem, with the idea of a vessel. But then I think, other reasons perhaps, being a little bit more specific of, how toys can become haunted is, one, residual energy, I think, is one where, somebody loves a stuffed animal or a doll so much, and they kind of become part of it. I think that may be one. I do think, like the vessel, sometimes you try to possess. Sometimes people will try to possess a certain object, and that's another way. And then I think there are times that it's not even tried, that, a spirit just attaches itself to an object, and sometimes it's specific because they own that doll, or sometimes it's just because it was convenient. Maybe the doll was in a place that there was a lot of spirit activity, and then and you have one of these spirits decide, well, I'm going to attach to this item and be able to manifest in other areas and understand perhaps why my spirit life is like this.
So when you're talking about, we're talking attachments and vessels and residual energy, which I believe residual energy is just really, like you said, when we go to where we're going to go after we leave here, our energy has to go somewhere. It disperses, and sometimes it goes to something that was very important to us. Robert the Doll, if my understanding is correct on the history of Robert the Doll, wasn't that something that would you think would be more residual, or how would you have seen something like Robert the Doll done?
I think Robert the Doll, like from the accounts that I understand, is a little boy receives this doll, he loves it, and he immediately falls in love with it, but there's immediately things that begin to happen that are strange with this doll. And so I would say, that Otto, the owner of Robert the Doll, the original owner, experienced the haunting of Robert. So does his parents. So did people around, passerbys that would go to their home would sometimes see Robert moving about in the home and these kinds of things. These are at least eyewitness accounts of what people have said. So I would think that would fall under more of the idea of a possessed object, where a spirit attached itself to a physical object and then manifests. And supposedly that attachment is still in existence, and you can still be able to experience Robert in a museum in Florida. And I, unfortunately, the exact museum and location escapes me, but I know it's in Florida. And you can actually even go online and you can get a replica of Robert the Doll yourself to keep in your home. Perhaps it's a good Christmas present.
I would love a Christmas present like that. So, I have always kind of wondered about that, whether the other thing I've thought about with toys as well is if people are so extremely gifted, maybe like Otto, the original owner, is it possible to project their energy into the doll and maybe call things forward that, like you said, now it has an attachment to her, or it's become a vessel, or something's happened to the doll that's made it
I think
manifest itself the way it has.
I think that's definitely possible, and I see that as is something that we still don't understand a lot about, as far in the parapsychology world and the paranormal world as well. Like, the understanding that the living can actually create a haunting, kind of, as well as just not just the dead. So I do find that really interesting, and especially I think there's just so much to learn about that. Unfortunately, I wish I could comment more, but I don't know if I know enough.
Well, I guess that's what they would call typically a poltergeist in the world we work in, where the living can actually create something.
Yeah, I mean that
manifests itself.
I think that's the only word for it. While it wouldn't fit the traditional idea of a poltergeist, I can definitely see that word being
it's the only word that kind of goes together.
And I think that they're just given an idea of residual haunting and people trying to get into a better understanding of residual hauntings. I think that in itself will be a subject of many experiments, maybe even with ourselves soon, that we can get together and run some experiments on residual energy and kind of understand that a little bit more, perhaps.
Yeah, and with toys, didn't back in the days when children didn't have time to do stuff and go out and things like that, the toys they had is all they had to play with, when they were indoors. And I think that's where a lot of the nostalgia comes from, the toys.
Yeah, yeah, and I think a lot of us, if we think about childhood is a time where we don't have to worry about stuff so much. We are able to have fun, we're able to play, we're able to do these things, and it's a time in which our minds are developing, and there is, I think, a really big strength to that. Young minds being able to see and develop, and I think that young people are much more apt to be able to either experience a haunting, create a haunting, or coexist with a haunting in a lot of ways. I think that as a child, being a psychic medium, one of the things that would happen to me is I would get so mad that things around me would happen. And, and usually what it was, I quickly began to learn that I could trip people if I got mad enough. And so it was like this thing that I would do is I would literally create a way for people to trip on themselves.
It's so funny you say that, because I do believe that people who are gifted, and I think anger, and maybe that has something to do with what happens to some of the hauntings and possessions. When somebody like you who's gifted, or like me, even when myself, I've noticed that when I get very angry about something too, strange stuff happens.
Yeah.
And so you have to constantly try to maintain control over your emotions.
And I think as a child, you're connected to that. And, the other thing about children and hauntings is that, there are many scientists and parapsychologists who believe that as a child, we have a little bit of a advantage as far as peripheral vision. And so we're going to see a little bit more. And so there are parapsychologists that believe that children are able to experience hauntings because what they're going to experience is the ability to see further into the peripheral. And that's often where we can tap into that other dimension or the spirit world, those kinds of things. But as we get older, our eye shape does change a little bit. And so that peripheral dies down a little bit. But if you kind of think, most of the time when I have a client tells me, I've experienced a haunting, I'm seeing my mom, perhaps, but she's on, it's like I only see her at the corner of my eye for a second, then she disappears. And I kind of look at that, I'm like, well, that's really significant, because I do think that peripheral vision can really be a factor in whether we can see and experience the paranormal. And I do think that certain people, and young people in particular, will have the ability to see a little more.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
So also, I want to kind of go back to, the doll kind of stuff. And, of course, haunted dolls in the last 5-10 years have been everywhere. Why do you think that people all across the world, not just in America, but all across the world, are fascinated by haunted toys, especially dolls?
I think just since Hollywood's been around, or stories have been around about dolls, just in particular,
Sure.
The resemblance to us as human beings, them having been related to as vessels. And you watch movies like Annabelle and Chucky and all these things. They have been used over time, instead of being that little plaything that the kids used to have. Now it's something that was an innocent toy being made into something that is now a way to communicate with the dead, something that people are afraid of. I guess people like you and I who work in this industry, it's not something that scares us. But I think for the most part, dolls creep a lot of people out, just like clowns do.
Yeah.
Clowns are supposed to be this cute little toy, but then you have mass murderers that use the clown as a figure to go out and do what they did.
Gacy. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think sometimes the things of innocence and youth are used to make something into something it's not, and that's why I think the fascination with
Yeah.
the hauntings, and they're evil and they're bad, and all these movies come out about Annabelle and Chucky and Robert the Doll and everything like that to scare people. um, and people like to be scared. That's why they
Yeah.
make number one box office hits out of horror
Yeah, of
movies.
course. And I kind of look at why are we fascinated with horror? Like, we can just go off on this tangent for a little bit. Like, and I think that often as a society, we're told we got to be tough. We got to be this. We got to be that. We've got to be in control. We've got to be able to handle everything that comes our way. So then we go to a horror movie and we're sitting in the theater, and it doesn't matter if you're, like a big old muscly dude, you're still, it's okay. You're in the dark. It's okay if you jump. It's okay if you're like, and you let out that. It gives people a place to be themselves. And I think that's really impressive about horror. And I would say that I think that while many people are really afraid of dolls, I think in some ways it may just remind them that they can be themselves, even if that's scary.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think being afraid also reminds you you're alive.
Yeah.
Because sometimes we live day to day, and why do people go pay the amount of money to go to a movie to go see a horror movie? Why do you want to go get scared? Because sometimes I think we live so mundanely that that adrenaline that you feel, that fear, it reminds us that we're human and we're
Sure.
alive, and that any day things can change for us.
Yeah.
And I think
I'll agree with that. Yeah.
that's a huge part of it.
Yeah. In some ways that idea has been an idea that people have struggled with throughout the centuries. Yeah. So in your words, I also want actually. So for listeners out there, I think that many people have hauntings in their homes, have hauntings that they've heard about in their life that they're growing up with, and I think a lot of people are kind of afraid sometimes to understand that, to come to like terms with that. I think that it bothers people. I think people are embarrassed about hauntings a lot. And so I kind of want, in your own words, for you to kind of share with us what, I guess, how do I put this? Like, what are the signs that something may be haunted, especially a toy or an inanimate object? What are signs that people out there can look for that may help them to identify this and maybe get some help if they're experiencing a haunting that's coming out of an object or a toy?
Well, I think there's two things. You're going to have the physical part of it, and you're going to have the emotional part of it. So for me, typically I pick up vibes on something. And I would say that a lot of times, and I hesitate to call them negative vibes, but I'm going to use that word because a lot of times with things that are attachments to something, there's something painful, there's a reason they're not moving on, there's a reason that they're there, and they attach themselves to something because they don't want to go anywhere else, or they're too hurt to move on, or they've got too many emotions going on to be able to move on, and they stay somewhere where hopefully somebody like myself or you can hear them, pick them up, and possibly communicate with them.
Sure.
And like in your case, or even in Diana, who's another part of SCSP, can help people move on to where they need to go. And could there possibly be that absolutely negative bad thing going on? Yes. Has it ever happened to me? No.
Sure.
I think most of the ones that I've experienced with my toys has been something that is just, it usually feels painful. It usually feel hurt. Origins also are huge, where the object came from.
Yeah.
Where was it at? My two most haunted dolls that I have, which is Gwen and Genevieve, came over from the UK, and I don't think the dolls, when they were originally created and designed, were haunted, but they took the dolls and took them to a children's insane asylum and took pictures of them in there, and something happened, and something attached themselves, and they came back. So origins, the history behind where the piece came from, what was attached to that, just like Otto and Robert the doll.
Yeah.
You know, everything has something that's got an origin behind it that can also make a
Sure.
difference. Of course, you can hear sounds. A lot of times my dolls are misplaced or moved, or, you know, they're not where I left
Sure.
them, or they just, you know, end up doing things at night and you could hear them. So there's a lot of
Sure.
audio that goes on with it. And there can also be some harmful actions. And again, myself, never have had that happen, but I do know through other paranormal people that this has
Sure.
happened. Now,
Yeah.
with my particular dolls here, I had a doll that I just sent off to the doll hospital because I came out one morning and her hands were missing and her face had been cracked, and I sent her off to go get her fixed and there was no explanation for it. She was sitting on top of my piano and her hands were just gone.
Yeah.
I couldn't explain that, and I had another doll that I had kept finding her all over the place, and I eventually put her up in a cupboard so that, you know, she would quit moving everywhere. And when her owner came back, because they had left her with me for a while, Diana came back for her. And I said, "Oh, she's in the cupboard." We went and opened up the cupboard, and her arms had been ripped off. How that happened, I can't explain that. And then I have some theater clowns that one of them just always looks like its eyes are following you, just like those paintings that you see in museums. So those are the type of things that I would, if I was looking for something in a doll, as far as some type of haunting, attachment, or any of those
Sure.
type of things, that's what I would look for.
Okay, great. I think that's helpful to a lot of folks out there. Do you think that, often, hauntings of toys are purely, just residual energy that, is passed down from the that's been imparted by a child, and it just kind of utilized and made its home into that being? I know we've touched a little bit on residual energy, but I think that, it's kind of worth visiting a little bit more.
Yeah, on residual energy, I do think that it does have a lot to do with the person that was connected with the object. I can tell you just from even animals that I've had that have passed away, you feel their energy around you, or you see them, or you see things around you. And it's not necessarily that it's them haunting you.
Sure.
It could be that they're visiting you, or is it the residual energy? So I would say that residual energy, absolutely, when somebody departs, and if there's something that's very important to them, they will leave behind
Sure.
something that will constantly be replaying like a record over and over.
Yeah, sure. No, that makes a lot of sense. Now, I found this really interesting little poem a while back, and I thought it was really interesting and creepy, and I just want to read it for everybody out there, just because it really is kind of just this fun little interesting creepy thing, and perhaps it has, even the words, has a little bit of residual energy. And so this poem was created at a time in which children, they needed to work, they needed to be able to contribute to their families,
Right.
and they couldn't really play during the day, and so this was kind of an idea of playing at night and playing when all the lights had already went off. And I just thought it kind of fits in with Christmas and fits in with the residual energy and the memories that one might have. So I'm going to read this for everybody. Girls and boys, come out to play. The moon doth shine as bright as day. Leave your supper and leave your sleep, and come with your playfellows into the street. Come with a whoop, come with a call, come with a goodwill or not at all. Up the ladder and down the wall, a half a penny roll will serve us all. You find milk and I'll find flour, and we'll have pudding in half an hour. This nursery rhyme came from the year 1708, and it's an anonymous author, but there was a gentleman that collected a lot of these poems and curated them a little bit into books, and his name was James Harwell Phillips, and he was the one that shared this with the world. And I think there is that interesting energy that comes from sometimes not even just an object, but the literary works of the world in some ways.
Absolutely. It's kind of like we had talked about earlier, just that combined energy. And maybe it's not just one person, it could be multiple. It could be, the whole village itself, the whole children themselves that were there. Because some of the pieces I even have are very, very old. And that doll was probably passed down from,
Sure.
sister to sister to sister. And probably made by somebody in the village that made it for them. And so
Yeah.
I think the residual energy from that absolutely goes into that. And I think that poem is absolutely beautiful in explaining that.
Well, very cool. Thank you for sharing. So now I have a question for you. This Christmas, if you could get any haunted doll in the world as part of your collection as a gift, what would it be?
Okay, probably not most people would want this, but I would either want Robert the doll or Annabelle.
All right.
Those would be my Christmas wish dolls.
All right, cool. And why?
Because I love to experience the supernatural and the paranormal. I guess I'm not afraid of it. And I think there's so much more out there for us to find out and learn. And I would love to be able to work with them and see what more I could find out about those dolls.
Yeah, very cool. Thank you. So did you know that at one time around the holidays, it was actually custom to light a fire and to tell ghost stories? Why do you think so much of our Christmas season is associated in a lot of ways with darkness? Like even the idea of Santa Claus, the idea of him looking and watching us and making sure that we're behaving, that's a little dark, at least for me it is.
That used to bother me as a child too. Santa Claus Coming to Town, that song, you better watch out, you better not cry. And so he's like watching you all the time. I even saw this parody the other day about the little shelf on an elf. Oh, no, elf on a shelf. And the whole parody was about the elf on a shelf is supposed to be watching you the whole time and then report back to Santa Claus.
Sure.
I thought, well, that is so freaking creepy. Why would you have somebody spying on me year round?
Yeah.
But that kind of goes into, I guess we had talked a little bit earlier about fear and control of the children or even adults, to behave yourself.
Yeah.
Because if not, there's going to be consequences to what's going to happen to you if you don't behave. If you're good, you get Christmas presents. If you're bad, you get coal. If you're good, you get Santa Claus. If you're bad, you get Krampus.
Yeah.
So your history on Krampus, because you're a little bit more of a history buff than I am. All I know is it's the European thing. That's it.
Yeah. So I mean, I won't go too much into Krampus, but basically the idea is that Krampus originated in most likely Austria. Of course, in Germany and Austria and many other European nations, they celebrate it. Actually, in America, we're starting to celebrate it. I think the closest Krampus full-scale street parade in the United States is up in New Orleans. They do a full, street parade for Krampus.
Really? I didn't know that.
And then we do have a small one here that's over at Victoria Black Swan Inn in San Antonio. So, but Krampus, it's himself was, his feast day is the day before the feast of St. Nicholas. So that would be December the 5th. And it was thought that Krampus was, in a way, the evil twin of Santa Claus. And so the idea is that what Krampus would do is he would punish. He would come to punish those children and even adults that hadn't lived a life of good measure. And then, of course, those that didn't need to be punished would be rewarded by his good twin brother, which would be Saint Nicholas. And so I think that, from very, long experience within folklore, that these kinds of ideas of control have been part of our holidays, even longer before Krampus.
Right.
Yeah.
I would totally agree with that. I think fear and control has been used for a long time. And I think that's why you see some of the darkness that surrounds Christmas, whether it's, like I mentioned, I hope if I had anything, I hope I would get coal, not Krampus, just like.
Well, I mean, there's a few versions of Krampus. One is that he just beats children with birch sticks until they get all red and puffy. And then the other idea is that he will kidnap children and take them and either eat them or bring them to the netherworld to let them atone for their sins for the rest of eternity. So it is really interesting to look at. Now, Charles Dickens wrote one of the most well-known ghost stories of all time, which of course is The Christmas Carol. Why do you think it is so popular still to this day?
I think it has the same message, just in a different way. This is what you were in the past, and of course they're using your childhood, your youth, your innocence as the past, and then they bring you into the present to who you are today, and then you have a choice going forward. So you go from the present and you go from the past to the present and into the future. If you don't behave, you're going to be a chained up ghost stuck in this world miserably.
Yeah.
So again, it goes back to those same type of things that they try to teach you with the other stories that they said as when we were children.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that you do make a good point. I think that I just find it so interesting that, of course, one of the greatest Christmas stories ever told is a ghost story. I think that's so cool, and I kind of cling to that in some ways, and I look at this idea not only about control, but the idea of learning from the spirit world. Of course, this was the foundation of spiritualism back in the 1840s to the 1920s, and it was a booming thing even here in America. We look at that and we look at this idea that we can learn from the spirit world, and Ebenezer Scrooge is the man of bah humbugs and thinking that Christmas is a waste of time and a waste of money and a waste of resources. And then we find him going through these stories of the present, the past, and the future, and then realizing that he needs to change his life, that he needs to transform, that he needs to embrace light, love, and joy. And so then you find out this man who is so cheap and didn't want to have anything to spend or do for Christmas goes and buys the biggest geese that there is to buy that next morning, and his persona is completely changed. So perhaps Charles Dickens did us all a little bit of a favor by reminding us that there are second chances in life, and maybe we can get that from the spirit world.
Well, I would have to agree with that, because I think the ghost or spirits, entities, whatever people want to call them, because there's not a specific name that we can give them, they do have a huge impact on who you are,
of course,
and who you become. I believe myself personally, I have become a better person. I've been growing because of my interaction with the spirit world. Exactly. And I think that if anyone ever has the opportunity, unless you feel it's negative, bad negative,
sure.
I would absolutely embrace it, because I do think it gives us an opportunity to grow and learn.
Yeah, of course. Second chances for everyone.
Absolutely.
Do you have any holiday stories that are dealing with hauntings that you might want to share with me?
Okay. When I was around 8 years old, we had gone to Mexico, because that's my country where my mom's from, my father's from. And we were playing ball. And I remember the ball rolling underneath into a basement, because the basement door was open. And as I was going in, and it was in between Christmas and New Year's, because, Latins, we all get together, Christmas, New Year's, it's got to be the big, Mexican party. Everybody shows up from the family. And I followed the ball in there. And as I was going in to reach for the ball, I just remember a pair of eyes staring back at me. And I didn't know what it was. I remember being scared, not terrified, but I just had no explanation for what I was seeing. And it wasn't in a human form. I remember seeing it kind of like a cat or a dog or an animal down there. Sure. Maybe it could have been. I'm not saying that what I saw was paranormal, but what I felt along with what I saw, I really do believe that was my first paranormal experience when I went to reach for the ball. Later on, we found out the house that we were staying in, it actually had been turned into a school. And in the front music room, there was a wooden floor. And during the Revolution in Mexico, they had hid people underneath the floor. And they had come in, the soldiers had come in and killed everybody underneath the basement. And all the bones were found there later by my family when we went in and discovered that that was there. So I think what I saw that day was probably, like we talked about, either residual energy or something that was going on, or even a haunting, because the whole family has stories about that one location of things that happened.
That's very interesting.
But that was actually my very first experience that I can recall, maybe at 8 years old.
Yeah.
That I saw things that other people didn't see or experience.
Yeah. That's really cool. Now, I remember hearing this story. It took place during Christmas time, and it was definitely a ghost story. We're both from San Antonio, and here in San Antonio, Texas, we have the missions. And the missions are really a beautiful and prevalent, aspect of the city, especially within our tourism. But there's also a lot of dark history with the missions, because they were used as a way to control the indigenous populations, to convert them, it also brought disease to the indigenous people that,
right.
That they actually weren't immune to. And then if they didn't cooperate with the Spanish, they were displaced and they were hurt. And so, I heard this one story growing up, and it always kind of stuck with me. And it was supposedly there was a gentleman. He had went to Christmas Eve Mass over at Mission San Jose, and that San Jose is really the biggest mission. And so he goes to Mass over there, and he lives in the neighborhood. And so he walks to church, and he masses over, and he walks back. And as he's leaving the Mission San Jose, he sees this dog, this black dog, and it begins to follow him. And as it follows him, he kind of like has an eerie feeling. And he keeps going, and he looks back, and he notices, I think the dog got bigger. And he keeps going, and it seems like the dog is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so it's literally like a giant, like this King Kong-sized dog. And he starts running, and this is an older gentleman, and he starts running. He gets to the door of his house, he opens it up, and he looks back, and there's absolutely nothing there. And so that story has kind of stuck with me for a while, and so the idea of, perhaps these animal energies that have been left behind, perhaps the, hints of injustice that, was given to our Native, Americans in this area. I've just always thought it was a really interesting story.
That is awesome. I hadn't heard that story, but that is an awesome story.
Then the other story that happened personally to me is my grandfather raised me. He was really my father, and he died in 2003. I was 19 years old at the time, and I really took it hard. It was just like it had just weighed on my heart. He died in June, and here it is, months later, and it's going to be Christmas. It's a few days before Christmas. I think it's like the 23rd, if I remember correctly. So December 23rd, 2003, I'm just kind of thinking, gosh, this is going to be a really crappy Christmas. Like, it's the first Christmas without him. Like, I was not looking forward to it, and like feeling really heartbroken, and just kind of thinking of him. I remember going to bed and just being in a crappy mood. I go to bed, and I'd probably been asleep maybe 10 minutes, and all of a sudden I'm in a dream state, and I see my grandfather come to me, and he comes into my room, he sits on my bed, and he smiles at me, looks me straight in the eye, and says, "I can see everything perfectly now." And I just shot up. I shot up from bed, and I started like weeping and crying, because before he died, he went blind. He couldn't really see at all, and he was a handyman. He could fix anything. He was this guy that like could do anything with his hands and, fix. And he was like an engineer without having that kind of degree. And so it would frustrate him to no end that he couldn't see anymore. And he would always complain like, "Damn it, I just can't see anymore." Like, I just remember him, the "damn it" word always coming out of his mouth. And then when he visits me, "I can see everything perfectly now." And it was such a magical moment for me. It really changed how I would see death and dying, and how I would see the understanding of transition of spirit. And I've carried that story with me to give me some hope, ever since. I just thought it was such a wonderful visitation by him.
Well, it's beautiful.
Yeah. In talking about that, I also want to talk a little bit about the origins of Christmas itself. What is there anything you can share with what you know about the origins of Christmas?
Well, for me, when you look back through history, a lot of the holidays that we celebrate today in Christianity have been taken from pagan holidays.
Yeah. Course.
And they obviously have some kind of meaning to people around the world. So I look at some of the holidays today and try to be a little more open-minded about how they are and what they represent. But for the origins, I couldn't really tell you that much because
Sure.
I'm not the historian buff here. that would be Fred, guys.
Yeah, well, I'll share a little bit of what I know about the origins. Of course, we have winter solstice, in a lot of parts of Europe that people would celebrate. And really, that holiday is where we get the Christmas tree from. We get the wreaths, using the wreaths. We use the greenery from Christmas. All these things originate from that time, originate from bringing in a little bit of, brightness and cheer into a time that was dark and cold and bitter, and it was also a confusing time because if you think about it, they didn't have watches back then. They didn't have an iPhone. They didn't have any of this stuff. So, all of a sudden the weather began to change. The when the sun goes down is changing. All these things are changing. So it became just a marker. It became, their version of a calendar or a clock or whatever to understand the season and to understand a little bit about, agriculture. But it's also where now we take so many of the very popular symbols of Christmas, of course, the Christmas tree and the wreaths and those things that I just mentioned. And then, of course, there is the ancient Rome, and we look at Saturnalia, which was the festival of the god Saturn. And Saturn, of course, was the agricultural god, so the god that can control the harvest and the food and all these kinds of things. And of course, at winter time, a lot of this changes. The plants become dormant and all those kinds of stuff. So it marked having to thank Saturn in some ways, or celebrate Saturn, because of course if they did this, it would bring about hopefully good crops for the next season. And so it was common to host a sacrifice of an animal, to have big feasts, to get drunk in the streets, and even to have an occasional orgy during this time. But this is also the time that we get the exchange of gifts. The idea of exchanging gifts back and forth from each other. And the Romans were the first people to do that. And so I just think it's interesting because the Catholic Church, of course, initially wasn't all that successful. And they a lot of, we hear the story of the martyrs of the church and, people being killed for their beliefs and all that kind of stuff. And the Catholic Church went through an area of trying to gain power and wealth. Those very important things, power and wealth. And so, they saw that there were still many people who had not converted to Christianity. And this is, in the, I think it's 336 AD, they began to see this. They began to notice that we need more followers. We need to get more money. We need more power. And so they adopted these Roman holidays so that way they could get followers, they could get that dollar, they could get more money, they could, because everybody was already celebrating. December 25th was pretty much the final feast of Saturnalia. And so why not welcome and party with us over here? We'll do this and we'll give you this, and we have those wreaths and we have these Christmas trees too. And so I think that they used it in a way to gain power and control, kind of like Santa Claus and Krampus and all these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. It's interesting that even from a religious standpoint, that's how Christmas kind of came about. And so the idea is that, well, we should have some kind of feast to celebrate the birth of a savior. And so it was very convenient that the end of Saturnalia was December 25th. So let's go ahead and assign that as the birth of Christ. We'll celebrate it then. even though historians and theologians and archaeologists, they don't even think that Christ was born in the month of December. They think that Christ was most likely born in the spring, but that's what we celebrate. We celebrate it on December 25th because of Saturnalia and what that meant for the Roman Empire, the pagans of that time, and what that would eventually mean. I also like to point out that, there's more time in history that we have not celebrated Christmas than we have celebrated, and, it was a very small festivity, when it first began. These were little things. And then, and then we get to the Puritan society, over in England, and then that came over to America, and they thought these kinds of celebrations were frivolous and they were evil because they originated from a pagan root source. They thought that they were, that one shouldn't waste time or effort partying because it was unholy. And so I don't know if you realize, but actually it was illegal to celebrate Christmas in America for a long time. In fact, we didn't even get our first official celebration of the holiday until 1836. That would be that would be Alabama. It's also the same year as the Battle of the Alamo. Alabama would be the first state to actually recognize it as a celebration, as a holiday. And then the last state to recognize it would be 1907, and it would be Oklahoma. So I think it's very interesting that we look at Christmas and those lights, and that we look at Christmas as a time that may not just be about the birth of Christ, but perhaps is about a time of second chances.
I would say that would be, sorry about my dogs.
No problem.
I would say that is, I would agree with that. It is definitely a time to reflect back on what your life has been, what you're looking at accomplishing in life,
Sure.
and where you want to go. And absolutely, just like the resurrection with Christ, I think it is almost second chances. Give everybody a second chance. Yeah. And I know you have a really good, interesting story on that, but that'll be for another show.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We are all out of time for tonight, but I wanted to take the time to wish all of our listeners and to wish you, Roxy, a happy holiday season. May you all find hope and beauty in this season. May your traditions include love and ghost stories. May the memories of the Christmas past fill you with warmth and haunt your holiday season. Thank you so much, Roxy. It's been an absolute pleasure to visit with you and to talk about Christmas with you. Thank you to everyone who has been listening. Please don't forget that you are listening to the Above Paranormal Network. If you have any questions, you can find me on Facebook and Instagram under Curious Twins Paranormal, or you can visit CuriousTwins.com. You have been listening to Talking to the Dead with Fred. Thank you. Good night. You have been listening to Talking to the Dead with Fred. You can join us at AboveParanormal.com. If you have a story to share, or if you feel like you have no one to talk to, please visit us at AboveParanormal.com. Feel free to share it with our community and our open forums.